Your brain works differently when you're alone. Externally, they appear calm, highly autonomous, emotionally self-contained. But this is not personality. This is not character. This is not attitude. This is neurological adaptation to an environment that no longer exists. If you were born between 1965 and 1985, your brain developed inside what neuroscientists would call an uncontrolled natural experiment in human development. And that experiment left permanent marks. To understand what happened, you need to understand how emotional regulation normally develops. In typical childhood development, regulation is co-constructed. A child experiences distress. Their nervous system floods with cortisol. Their heart rate accelerates. Fear or frustration takes over. And then, critically, an adult intervenes. A calm voice, a steady presence, physical reassurance. The child's cortisol drops. Their breathing slows. Their prefrontal cortex observes, when I signal distress, safety arrives. This pattern repeats thousands of times across childhood. It's called emotional scaffolding. The adult's nervous system teaches the child's nervous system how to regulate. But Generation X grew up during a massive sociological shift that removed the scaffolding on an unprecedented scale. Between 1970 and 1984, divorce rates doubled. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, a necessary and overdue change, but child care infrastructure didn't keep pace. The result? Millions of children came home to empty houses, not occasionally, daily, for hours, with no one checking in, no adult nervous system to buffer their stress, no external regulation available. Picture this with sensory precision. It's 3:30 p.m. The school bus drops you off. You're 8 years old. You walk up the driveway. The neighborhood is quiet. No cars, no voices, just the distant hum of a lawnmower 3 streets over. You unlock the door with the key hanging from a shoelace around your neck. You step inside, and the house greets you with silence. Not the comfortable silence of solitude, the specific silence of absence. The refrigerator hums, the clock ticks, your footsteps echo on linoleum. No voice calls your name, no one asks how your day was. No adult energy exists in that space. You make yourself a snack, you do your homework at the kitchen table. The TV plays in the background, but it's not comfort, it's noise against the quiet. If you fall and scrape your knee, you rinse it yourself. If you feel scared, you manage it internally. If you feel lonely, you don't even have the vocabulary to name it yet. This wasn't neglect in the traditional sense. Your parents were working. They were doing what the economy demanded. But neurologically, your brain was adapting to a truth it had to encode. Help is not automatic. Comfort is not guaranteed. You are responsible for your own emotional stability. And here's what happened at the neural level. Silence did not emerge as a preference. Silence emerged as metabolic efficiency. When emotional signaling produces no immediate response, the brain recalibrates. Expressing distress becomes energetically expensive. Internal processing becomes neurologically dominant. Your nervous system optimized for self-containment. This adaptation physically rewired how your brain handles threat and stress. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, recalibrated its baseline activation threshold. It learned to distinguish between actual danger and discomfort I can handle alone. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and planning, developed predictive models based on self-sufficiency. It learned to scan 3 steps ahead, calculating outcomes, assessing risk, preparing for disruption. Your HPA axis, the hormonal system that manages stress, learned that cortisol spikes often had to be processed internally. No external soothing was coming. So your system became more efficient at bringing cortisol down without external input. This created what researchers call accelerated self-regulation capacity. You became neurologically competent at managing your internal state earlier than previous generations. But there's always a cost. The same mechanisms that created early competence also created discomfort with dependency. Because in your developing brain, autonomy became synonymous with safety, and reliance became associated with vulnerability. Not consciously, not philosophically, physiologically. Your brain encoded this as biological truth. I am safest when I need no one. This wiring shows up everywhere in adult Gen X behavior. You don't panic easily. When others spiral, you move to problem solving. You don't dramatize stress. Even when overwhelmed, your outward presentation remains stable. You don't seek reassurance. Validation from others feels awkward, sometimes even irritating. But this is not because you're unemotional. Generation X is not less emotional. Generation X is differently regulated. Your stress is real. Your exhaustion is real. Your emotional reactions are real. But they are processed internally before expressed externally. Expression is filtered through internal stability assessment systems, not routed through external reassurance circuits. To others, this looks like calmness, like detachment, like emotional distance. But internally, you are constantly regulating, constantly calculating, constantly containing. The difference is no one sees it happening. And this creates a painful paradox. The same independence that made you strong also made emotional reliance feel foreign. The same silence that protected your stability also isolated you. Strength and distance were wired together in your nervous system. Let's go deeper into the dependency mechanism because this is where Generation X psychology becomes most misunderstood. In a securely attached nervous system, asking for help triggers oxytocin release. Connection feels good, support feels safe. But in a nervous system trained for autonomy, asking for help can trigger subtle activation of threat circuits. Not dramatic anxiety, not panic, just a low-level activation of threat circuits. Your anterior cingulate cortex, the part of your brain that monitors for social risk, treats requests for help as exposure events. Because in your developmental learning, needing help meant being in a vulnerable state without backup. So your brain learned minimize need, maximize self-sufficiency, solve it yourself. This is why Generation X will work until 2 a.m. solving a problem rather than send one email asking for clarification. It's not pride, it's not stubbornness, it's a nervous system protecting against perceived exposure. To your amygdala, asking for help feels like unlocking the door to that empty house again and finding out it's still empty. So you just handle it yourself. This wiring becomes starkly visible in workplace environments. Generation X rarely signals capacity limits early. They don't send emails saying, "I'm overwhelmed." They don't request deadline extensions. They don't ask for emotional support during high-stress projects. Instead, they compensate. They adjust workload internally. They absorb complexity. They solve problems quietly. And when you ask them if they need help, they say, "I'm fine." But "I'm fine" doesn't mean I'm not struggling. It means I'm managing this internally because that's what my brain knows how to do. The danger is that this pattern is invisible to managers, invisible to partners, invisible to friends. Generation X doesn't break down dramatically. They don't post about burnout online. They don't create long threads about exhaustion. They just keep going, quietly, relentlessly, competently, until their body forces them to stop. Burnout in Generation X doesn't look like burnout. It looks like functional endurance sustained beyond biological limits. They don't break down, they wear down, silently. But there's another layer to Gen X neurology that's rarely discussed. Your brain also developed before instant informational access. Knowledge wasn't something you Googled, it was something you hunted. You stood in front of card catalog drawers in libraries, flipping through thousands of index cards to find one book. You wrote research papers with encyclopedias, taking handwritten notes because photocopying was expensive. When you needed to know something, you had to work for it, physically, temporally. And this friction created something neurologically valuable, deeper encoding. Cognitive psychology research shows that information requiring effort to obtain integrates more permanently into long-term memory. Your brain learned depth before speed, reflection before immediacy, mastery through persistence. This is why Generation X often seems cognitively out of step with younger generations. You don't skim, you read deeply. You don't multitask well, you focus intensely. You don't switch contexts rapidly, you maintain sustained attention. Not because you're slower, because your brain was optimized for different cognitive demands. So here's the complete picture. Generation X developed extraordinary capabilities. High competence under uncertainty. You don't freeze when plans collapse, you adapt. Calm during crisis. When others panic, your nervous system recognizes chaos as baseline. Independent problem solving. You can figure things out with minimal input. Deep cognitive processing. You think in layers, not headlines. Emotional steadiness. You don't create drama, you create solutions. But every adaptation carries structural costs. The independence that built resilience limited your comfort with reliance. The silence that protected stability restricted emotional visibility. The self-regulation that made you competent made vulnerability feel dangerous. This is not superiority. This is not deficiency. This is trade-off. Neurological adaptation always involves exchange. You gain capabilities in one domain, you sacrifice fluency in another. Generation X gained autonomy, but it came at the price of relational ease. You gained regulation, but it came at the price of emotional accessibility. You gained resilience, but it came at the price of knowing how to be held. And this is where the silent tragedy lives, because hyper-independence is a survival skill that saved you. But if you never learn to let someone else carry weight, if you never learn to signal need before you're at capacity, if you never learn that dependency doesn't equal danger, then independence becomes a prison, a quiet one, a private one, but a prison nonetheless. You can be surrounded by people and still be profoundly isolated, not because no one cares, but because your nervous system doesn't know how to receive care without interpreting it as risk. Cognitive reframe, the mechanism. Generation X did not develop an attitude problem. You developed a nervous system calibrated for autonomy under instability. Your brain learned early and learned deeply. Stability equals independence. Safety equals self-containment. Regulation equals silence. And once your amygdala, your prefrontal cortex, your HPA axis all encode that pattern, once 10,000 repetitions across childhood wire that pattern into your neural architecture, it doesn't just disappear. It becomes your baseline reality. Not because you're broken, because you adapted brilliantly to an environment that demanded it. Interaction trigger. If you're Generation X, I want you to notice something with precision, right now, in your actual life. How often do you instinctively solve problems alone, even when support is clearly available, even when exhaustion is already present, even when someone explicitly offers help? That impulse to say, "I've got it," is not random. It's not personality. It's decades of neurological conditioning protecting you from a vulnerability that once had no safety net. Cognitive echo. Your brain learned a long time ago that the door might be locked, but no one was coming, so you learned to open it yourself, and you've been opening doors yourself ever since. That empty house didn't break you, it built you. But the brain that kept you safe at 8 might be the same brain making connection hard at 48, not because you don't want it, because your nervous system doesn't recognize it as safe. If this analysis resonated with something you felt but couldn't name, if this explained a pattern you've lived but never decoded, subscribe to Cognirae. This channel doesn't simplify psychology, we decode the neural mechanisms behind lived experience. Comment below, do you solve problems alone even when help is available? Because that's not personality, that's neurology. And understanding the mechanism is the first step towards updating it.